Okay, so we are now a little over a month into distance learning, and we are now getting to the subject that a lot of you have been very eager to get to. A lot of you have asked me questions about this when they were getting to World War II, when they were getting to World War II. The answer now is today. Today is going to be our first look at the actual start of World War II. I know everything that we've been doing up to now has been a build up to it. It's been showing you who the different sides are, what the Nazis wanted, what the fascists in Italy wanted, what the nationalists in Japan wanted, and how all of that is going to start building towards a Second World War. Now, you might still be asking, still wondering, how does, I don't know, Hitler being anti Semitic, how does Hitler wanting to create living room for Germans lead to a Second World War? Well, that's what we're going to do today. Today is when we go ahead and connect all those dots. This is when it begins, I think, hopefully, to make sense. So, Hitler's Lightning War, the start of World War II. What should you remember? Last time, last class, what we focused about was how fascist nations like Germany, Italy, and Japan joined together in an alliance called the Axis power, right? That's why they're called the Axis. Maybe you've seen that in movies, maybe in video games. It's because they're all aligned. They're all on an axis, right? They all agree with each other. Even though they normally wouldn't necessarily get along, they all realize, hey, we all have common goals. We should team up to distract all these other countries so that we can get what we want. We've also taken a look at the atrocities. That means like the war crimes, the terrible things done to other people that took place during the Spanish Civil War in Guernica. We mentioned it briefly in the last Tuesday's lesson. We didn't really get to go into in depth into that one, but we did go in depth into the second one, Japan's invasion of China. Specifically, we looked at what happened when Japan took over Nanjing. And then we also looked at how Germany, Italy, and Japan began aggressively taking over other countries, while democratic nations like the United States, Britain, France are actually choosing to do nothing. They are choosing to appease them in order to prevent a Second World War. They're basically letting Germany and Hitler do whatever they want because they want to avoid a Second World War. Today, we're going to see just how that is probably actually doing more to lead to a Second World War than stopping it. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to see the consequences of this policy of appeasement. So by the end of today, three things, three parts of today's lecture. By the end of lesson 32.1a, you should be able to understand how Hitler's, quote, lightning war strategy was used to take over Poland, leading Britain and France to declare war on Germany. You'll also understand the Nazi invasion of France and its consequences, and you will also understand how Britain successfully resisted Nazi rule. So let's start off with the first one of those objectives, Hitler's Lightning War, Blitzkrieg. September 1st, 1939, that is the date that historians will usually say World War II begins. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler wanted a part of Poland called the Polish Corridor. I'm not going to go into details what that means, but there's basically a plot of land inside Poland that Hitler wants. He believed that no one was going to stop him. Why? If you remember from last class, you saw how Hitler, this isn't the first place he's trying to take over. He's taken over parts of Czechoslovakia. He's taking over Austria. He's moving into parts that he's not supposed to be moving soldiers into in Germany. And no one's stopping him. And the lesson that Hitler's learning is, yeah, if I do something, if I try to invade another country, Britain and France, the countries that are strongest enough to stop me, aren't going to do anything because they're too afraid of starting a fight. So he launches a surprise attack called a Blitzkrieg or a lightning war. Maybe you know in football something that the Blitz, right? That's based on this. And he quickly defeats the Polish forces. Now, only realizing the mistake that they've made, do Britain and France finally declare war on Hitler and Nazi Germany. So only after they let Hitler can like run amok in Europe, only after they realized the mistake that they did they finally say, okay, it's time to put an end to this. This is the start of the Second World War. Meanwhile, you may also remember, this is a little more nuanced, this was buried in there last week, but it's there. Remember Russia, Joseph Stalin. Hitler and Joseph Stalin hate each other, but they made an agreement that they would not attack each other. In fact, they actually made a deal. Germany would get one half of Poland, Russia would get the other half. That's what they do, more or less. Russia's dictator, Stalin, is also going to want to take over a country called Finland. More on them a little bit later. But you'll see that that is a big mistake for the Russians. So just a quick check for understanding. Here are the Finns, by the way. People from Finland are called Finns. So here's our first check for understanding. Number one, World War I started on September 1st, 1939. Number two, World War II started when Germany invaded Poland. And number three, when Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union, Russia, also invaded Finland. True and false? Take a few moments. All right, let's move on to the second part, the fall of France. France, and another mistake, was also being a little arrogant. They were suffering from what a general of World War I called the disease of victory. Remember, they won World War I. They defeated Germany, and they thought that they could defeat Germany again. So they didn't take Germany as seriously as they probably should have. They did have some defenses called the Maginot Line, where it was a bunch of bunkers on the French border facing Germany, except for one spot of the French border, the French and German border. In the middle of the French and German border, there's a forest called the Ardennes. The Ardennes is this forest right here. You see, it's very thick. It is so thick, the French thought, that no tanks could get through that forest. So what did the French do? Well, they didn't build any forts or any bunkers or any checkpoints along this forest. Sure enough, the Germans found roads to drive their tanks through the Ardennes forest. So the French make this huge mistake. The Germans take advantage of that mistake. They sneak their tanks through the Ardennes. When within a week, German tanks have taken over, German forces have taken over all of the north of France. There's a major evacuation. Maybe you've seen the movie Dunkirk, where a lot of soldiers, French soldiers, British soldiers, Polish soldiers who escaped Poland just in time, are now being cornered by all these tanks, by all these German soldiers in a city called Dunkirk. And what takes place is a lot of, like, it's a crazy story if we want to spend a lot more time on it, but the short story is a lot of ships from Britain, some military ships, a lot of ships that weren't military ships, just like some fishermen, some, travel, some cruise ships even go along to evacuate these soldiers from Dunkirk back to Britain. So that's what that movie Dunkirk is about. If you watched it and had no idea what was going on, that's what they're doing. They're evacuating these soldiers before the Germans can get to them. So what happens in German-controlled France? Right, because France loses, as we mentioned, the Germans take over all of this northern part of France, right? They kick out, they basically say, okay, we're not going to invade this southern part of France. We're going to let you control French people. You're going to be able to control this southern part of France. And we're going to put a capital here in this city called Vichy. Now, here's a few things. This is not like a free, democratic France anymore. The government of Vichy France is sympathetic to the Nazis. When people call someone Vichy or they make a reference to Vichy France, it's not a compliment. You're basically calling them backstabbers. And so a way to kind of simplify this history, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but a way to make it a little more simple is to imagine these are the French people who stabbed the back of the rest of the French. They're the ones who said, okay, yeah, we'll work with the Nazis. They're Nazi collaborators. And a lot of these Vichy French guys had Nazi sympathies. A lot of Nazis really liked the French. They basically saw the French as misguided Aryans. They also thought that the French were a part of the master race that they believed in, that they made up, that didn't really exist. But they thought the French were a part of them. And they thought, okay, over time, we can turn the French hearts over to us. Sure enough, they found a lot of French people who were happy that the Nazis were there. Their leader is a dictator named Marshal, that's his title, Philippe Pétain. So Philippe Pétain is the dictator now of Vichy France. Now, the French, not all the French supported the Nazis. In fact, famously, there is something called the French Resistance. After the evacuation at Dunkirk, French forces that escaped to Britain were called the Free French forces. That's these guys over here. And they're being led by a famous Frenchman named Charles de Gaulle. A few reasons why I think he was really popular. Well, first of all, he was 6'4", so he was definitely a presence whenever people saw him or he walked into a room. Sure, that's a big part of it. But I think also his last name plays a little bit into it. Historians have always wondered like how much of a role does his last name play into it. Charles de Gaulle is really interesting because his last name, Gallus, Gaul, is the old word for France. So a lot of he kind of represented that last name was kind of like, oh, he's the old France. We can rally around him. But it also sounds like the French word for rooster. The French word for rooster is Gaul, gallo, right? In Spanish, gallus in Latin. And I know, haha, the national animal of France is a chicken. Maybe that's why in the World Cup you maybe saw like the French team, the French soccer team with the roosters on their shirt. It's because that's their national animal. And yeah, I know roosters are really tough. They're really aggressive. They're really violent. But just some ideas why people thought, or why historians think people rallied around Charles de Gaulle. Anyways, so these are the French forces. But in France, the people who didn't get to escape in Dunkirk, there were a lot of French people who fought and died in this resistance who were anti-fascists. They weren't necessarily trained soldiers. I mean, none of these people in this picture are actually soldiers. These are just guns that were given to them by other resistance sympathizers, people selling them arms, people giving them weapons. And so they always gave the Nazis a really hard time. And that's actually, if you watch Star Wars, that's where the idea, this word of the resistance comes from, right? These are the people resisting fascism in France. Quick check for understanding. Again, number 2, France was fully prepared to fight Germany. Is that true or false? And number 5, French and British forces were evacuated from Europe in the evacuation of Dunkirk. All right, now finally on to the last part of our objective, the Battle of Britain. After the fall of France, only one country remained willing to fight against Hitler, Great Britain. Within a year, Nazi Germany defeated almost all of its enemies except for one country. It's kind of, I don't know if you've seen that meme with like the wall that's falling over and there's one pillar kind of holding it up. If you could imagine that, this is Nazi Germany and the Italian fascists all weighing down on the single pillar of Great Britain. Great Britain is literally the only country keeping the Nazis at bay. So Hitler turns his attention on the British. He wants to put all of the German power, all of the German Air Force against the British. His Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, that's German for Air Force, begins the bombing of London, the London Blitz. Some 20,000 civilians, normal people, not soldiers, are killed in this blitz. Hitler is trying to kill the morale in Britain. He's trying to make them feel weaker. And so every night, these German airplanes, the Luftwaffe, would come in and begin bombing the city of London and military bases in southern England. In one of the most heroic moments in world history, the Royal Air Force, vastly outnumbered, remember this took everyone by surprise. They didn't have the full Air Force ready to go. So they're outnumbered by the Germans, but they are going to fight every night against these Luftwaffe, and they are fighting valiantly. 2 things help them out. Maybe you've seen in like movies Radar, right? Where an airplane you can, or maybe weather radar. It's the same technology. Radar is invented. The Germans don't have radar. And they would always get confused whenever the British could easily figure out where they were going, right? They thought they were being sneaky, flying through the clouds, but then all of a sudden, the British Air Force would be there to surprise them. That's because they had radar. Radar enables you to see what's up in the sky, even if you can't actually see it. And then they had the Enigma machine. Maybe you've seen the movie The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch. It's about a guy named Alan Turing. He's the inventor of the modern computer. But then they had he invented something called the Enigma machine, which was able to break the German code. So every time the Germans would rewrite their code because they figured out, oh, the British caught our code, it would only be a matter of hours before the British could break the German code again. And the Germans never figured it out. The Germans could never figure out why the British were always breaking their code. They started thinking maybe it's some guy in the inside, maybe there's like a British spy inside the code, and they kept switching out the stuff. But no, they were just breaking the code, so that gave them a huge advantage. So whenever the Germans said to their like Air Force, go bomb this place in code, the British would quickly break the code and already be there to defend that city or that military base. I would also be mistaken if I didn't mention the strength of British leadership. This is one of my favorite historical figures, Winston Churchill. Now, the Battle of Britain, as I mentioned earlier, isn't just being fought because Hitler wants to invade Britain. He realizes that he needs to break the British spirit. He needs to win by breaking them mentally, by making them feel like victory is impossible. Winston Churchill knows that's his task, is to rally the British people, to give them the fire to keep fighting. This is one of his most famous speeches. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. He's meaning that about the Royal Air Force, how the Royal Air Force defended Britain, bought them enough time to strike back. And then this here is like the most important speech, the most famous one that he gives. Now, I want you to imagine the position that the British are in. As I mentioned earlier, they are the only country left fighting against Hitler at this point. Other countries will join eventually, but not in this moment in time. And no one knows that that's going to happen at this time. If you're a British person, things aren't looking so good. This is their darkest hour, and it's only going to get darker in the next lesson you're going to see. So Winston Churchill has to rally the team. He has to speak to them. So he goes in front of Parliament. Remember, that's the British government, the British Senate, if you will. And on the radio, broadcasting to the British people, delivers this speech. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, even though all our friends have been defeated, even though all the old empires are being gobbled up by the Nazis or will soon be gobbled up by the Nazis, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. I get shivers whenever I read that because he is saying, we're going to keep fighting until the last British person is dead. We are going to keep fighting. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And it gives me chills every time I read that because that is one of the most powerful paragraphs like ever written, and it rallies the British people into believing that, yeah, we're not going to give up. Even though we're the last people fighting against Hitler, we have to keep fighting. We're going to go down fighting. We're going to fight the last Nazi in the hills. If they can fight us in the beaches, we're not going down. For this reason, Winston Churchill is often compared to this bulldog, the English bulldog. If you know anything about bulldogs, they're actually trained as fighting dogs. They were bred originally as fighting dogs. If you corner a bulldog or a related dog, a pit bull, right, it's not just going to sit there. It's going to fight, right? And that's what the British are doing. And that's why sometimes you'll see the bulldog associated with Britain. Also, side note, he's not giving you a V for peace. It's a V for victory. They're fighting for victory is what they're doing. So that's what the V is about, at least in World War II, if you see that photo or people doing this. Anyways, here's our last check for understanding for today, for the start of World War II. After the fall of France, other countries united against Hitler. Did the rest of the world finally join in and back up Britain against Hitler? Is that true or false? Number 7. Germany failed to invade Britain due to the efforts of the Royal Air Force, along with inventions like radar and the Enigma machine. And then number 8, the leader of Britain during World War II was Winston Churchill. Take a few more moments just for this last check for understanding today. Okay, and for closing, just as you guys are familiar with this format, those of you who have been following along, you know right after the video lecture, we'll move on to the chapter reading on Actively Learn. And at the end of the chapter reading, you'll find the exit ticket. All of that at this point is routine, nothing new here, no surprises. But if you do have any questions, email me, amaduena@laalliance.org, or of course, feel free to drop into my office hours. I look forward to seeing some of your work. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe, stay healthy. Until Friday's lesson, goodbye.